Welcome to Growing Freedom. Today we're going to talk about a cornucopia of preparedness-related items. And at any given time, if you hear my livestock protection dogs in the background, well, you'll know that they're doing their job. Producer Ryan joins us for today's broadcast. Producer Ryan, how are you?
Doing well, Bob. How are you?
Very excited to get into a very personal show in light of recent events. I'll be able to speak anecdotally to putting into practice some of the themes that we talk about quite frequently on Growing Freedom. So we're going to talk about my hurricane experience of late, what we did to prepare, how we ended up. There's so many things that I could talk about. I also want to discuss my nanny state-loving neighbor who did not prepare, and we'll contrast the experience that we had with the mindset as a crazy doomsday prepper and compare it to somebody who was very vulnerable. And we'll talk about the scenario in which you have to open your doors to these neighbors that are hungry and did not prepare, and the community that's either built or destroyed in the case of an emergency. I also want to talk about a pretty epic injury that I experienced and the pressures of the lamestream medical mafia and what I did to actually heal myself, once again putting the themes that we talk about regularly into practice in my everyday life. So when the internet goes down and the grid goes down, if it goes down, when it goes down, that's when this work continues. And that's when we continue to grow freedom. We're going to be planting seeds until that time, and we'll be looking at a number of different things in addition to my anecdotal experiences. On today's show, we'll tell you a little bit about weather and how the weather can be manipulated, what that can do to food production, what that can do to, create a storm, deter a storm, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about government in times of emergency. We'll discuss what FEMA really is, or what FEMA really isn't, for that matter. We'll take an in-depth look at the FEMA camps and what they really are, and we'll look at how government fails in many cases when it comes to preparing or protecting us from a massive disaster. And there's plenty of examples of that, and that will be mostly in the second hour. But in this first hour, let's jump right into it. Ouch, Ryan. You saw the picture, right?
I saw the picture. It was it was a what the fuck moment, Bob. What happened? How did you get yourself in that predicament?
Well, first and foremost, don't be a slob. Make sure you put away your tools, folks. But even that being said, there was only so much I could do. I had a freak accident. The picture will be up on the website, growingfreedom.net. I ended up stepping on a pitchfork. Ouch. It went right through my foot. And it was weird because the handle of the pitchfork was a long wooden handle, and the pitchfork was obviously, I guess, steel, very hard steel. And and I know a lot of you are going to say, Bob, why didn't you wear boots? I'm into earthing. Earthing? Is that the word? Earthing? You know what I'm talking about, Ryan? Where you have bare feet on the ground?
Yeah. How did earthing feel when hardened steel went through your flesh, Bob?
Yeah, good question. I guess it wasn't that earthy after all once I stepped on the pitchfork. But no, so luckily, I had my cancer device on me, and I called 911. One of the rare times when calling 911 is needed and appropriate. Otherwise, I would have had to wait at least 3 or 4 hours until my wife got back home. So the reason for that was I could not move my foot at all because of the position it went in my foot. If I moved it at all, it felt as if the pitchfork was going to further dig into my foot. Now, folks, bear with me here, okay? Don't tune out. I'm trying to set this up, not to just give you this gory tale of a massive injury, freak injury. I'm setting this up because the aftermath of it was a major learning opportunity for both myself, and I think it's worthy of sharing with you. And that's why Ryan and I decided to bring it up. So I call 911, the paramedics come, and the first words out of the firefighter's mouth was, "Hey, Bob, how's it going? I follow a lot of your work."
No.
Yeah. I can't make this shit up, dude. Now, I don't get that very often, all right? And the point of me bringing that up is because for a split second there, I was thinking to myself, oh, shit, this guy either hates my guts and he's going to give me, he's going to, I don't know. I was thinking for a split second, he's probably seen me get into an encounter with local law enforcement, and he either hates my guts, thinks I'm a complete freak, or he's going to actually care about me and give me some help that I needed. But I was pretty vulnerable at that time. And anyway, so it turned out he was actually pretty cool. And what they ended up doing was chainsawing the handle off. And with the handle, the 5-foot handle, chainsawed off, I for the first time was able to readjust my foot and see the pitchfork in my foot. And the paramedics at that point said, "Well, you got to go to the hospital, dude." And I said, "I don't know about that." They said, "Well, we're not going to pull it out because you could bleed." And I said, "Well, let me think about this." So I started thinking about Ryan. The second I went to the hospital, what would the hospital have done for me? And I've always said time and time again that hospitals are good if you have a freak traumatic accident, right? So there is maybe a time for trauma-based injuries where you go to the hospital, they can sew you back up, that kind of thing. So I was tempted to go to the hospital. But then I started thinking about the rhetoric that is spewed by these doctors about tetanus and antibiotics and yada, yada, yada. And I was thinking, shit, I don't really want to deal with that. I can stand my ground, but what are they going to do for me at the hospital? What are they really going to do for me? So I started, thinking about it, and finally it's like, all right, let's just go, just in case it has pierced an artery. Let's just go, and that way they can stop me from bleeding out if need be. And they said, all right, we're going to go get our, stretcher. What do they call that? Stretcher? Yeah.
Yep.
Those things you wheel the guy off on. Mm-hmm. And we're going to take you in. So as they're leaving, I started having second thoughts. As they're going to get the stretcher, I'm thinking, oh shit, maybe I should just try to pull it out. And I tried pulling it out, wasn't coming out, and then I moved my foot a little bit over the other way, and boom, I pulled it out. Now, here's where we start getting educational. What is the first thing you do when you pull it out, Ryan, if you're now starting to hopefully bleed from that area? What is the first thing you do? I'm putting you on the spot here.
Oh, I would put pressure on the wound if you're starting to bleed. If you're in a situation where you can't get to first aid supplies quickly, you might have to look at putting a tourniquet or something on your limbs to slow the bleeding, because that's going to be
and that is definitely what you want to do if you've hit an artery, and if you have a massive amount of blood coming out. Mm-hmm. But due to the nature of it being a puncture wound, the first thing you want to do in this case is nothing. You want that puncture wound, because of the nature of it being narrow and deep, you want it to bleed, actually.
Why is that?
Within reason. And the reason for that is because when it bleeds, it is pumping oxygen through the wound, cleaning it and protecting it from dangerous pathogens that could have been infected into that area by then. So it's actually one of the best things you can do for healing and for protection from things like tetanus, the boogeyman, and I'm going to get to tetanus in just a second. So actually, Ryan, I let it bleed for a little bit. And I'm glad I did in hindsight. I really am. Because I do believe that helped in my miraculous healing process. So I let it bleed. The paramedics came back and, they said, "Oh, you pulled it out." And I said, "Yep, I did." And they said, "Well, okay, what do you want to do?" I said, "Well, if I go to the hospital, what are they going to do for me at this point?" And they said, "Yeah, they'll probably want you to get a tetanus shot. You need to get a tetanus shot. You will die if you don't get a tetanus shot. You're going to die." This is what they're telling me, Ryan. You will die without a tetanus shot. And mind you, it kind of made sense. This is your textbook case of how tetanus, something that's pretty rare when you look at the actual statistics, but this is the textbook case on how tetanus could get infected into your body. It's a dirty pitchfork that was rusty and, more importantly, was used to toss around compost from a cornucopia of animal feces. Okay, that's exactly where tetanus comes from, supposedly. I don't know.
So
But
basically, just a bacteria shish kebab. That's
bacteria
basically what
shish kebab. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Come get your bacteria shish kebabs, folks. So, all right. So, my first instinct is, absolutely not. Thanks very much, but I'll take my chances. I'll die because I need to do a little bit more research and I need to figure this out for myself. And then the guy said, well, this is paramedic guy, not the guy who came first who knew me. But then the guy said, "Well, what's your name?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Do I have to start giving you my whole life story? Can you guys just take off? Thanks for coming." He said, "Oh, so I take it you're a libertarian." And then I proceeded to get into a 5-minute, 10-minute talk with this guy who ended up being a pretty open-minded guy. And he said, "We should really talk sometime." So leave it to me, Ryan, to be in this vulnerable, crazy situation and open up a conversation that we might have on the podcast with some random paramedic who's of a freedom mindset. Anyways, that was pretty cool. And I said, "Well, listen, I'm going to give you my name. I'm not going to give you my, DNA code and my social security code and all that stuff. And I'm not going to let you chip me, but I will give you my name and look me up on online and stay in touch. Tune into Growing Freedom," I told him. So, all right, so they leave, and I'm letting it bleed, and it's starting to slow down bleeding. And then I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. Because I am genuinely worried about tetanus, but more so about infection. So I'm up all night revisiting things that I had looked at one point way back when about the tetanus shots, what they really are, what they really aren't, where tetanus comes from, how tetanus can be treated. And I start watching a lecture from Dr. Suzanne Humphreys. And she did this amazing presentation on tetanus in particular. She's done a lot of work on vaccinations and the dangers of vaccinations, but she did some specific work on tetanus and tetanus shots or tetanus vaccinations. By the way, is that a big thing in Canada for you, Ryan? Tetanus shots? Do they pump those there?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's recommended to youth, and I've heard rumors that it's being lumped in with other boosters and whatnot, so you're going to get it no matter what. Years ago, I did run into a similar situation where I had an injury to my hand, and that's the first thing they do. They give you that booster, they give you that tetanus. So,
yep.
I wasn't as educated as I am now about some of these topics, and you just blindly accept and go, okay, I don't want to
Well,
die, right? That's
yeah,
that's the line they feed you, and there's really little choice in the matter.
you're truly intimidated with
Yeah,
their
yeah,
fear, man. They are really scaring the hell out of you, and
absolutely.
nobody wants to die, and well, not nobody, but so it's scary. And by the way, write a note. We're trying to do these shows to be tangible resources, to be solution oriented. But at one point, let's do a vaccine show, right? Where we do all the vaccine, an in-depth expose on vaccines because you were mentioning these all-in-one now. These they've been making these multi-vax where they put a whole bunch of them in one shot. But now I just saw on the internet the other day that they have one vaccination with 20 vaccines or some ungodly number of vaccines all in this one shot.
Yeah.
So they're continuing the progression of pumping the vaccines and getting those into the population. But I digress. So, all right, so I'm researching tetanus, and it turns out, and I wish I had better notes here in front of me, but I urge you guys to look at it. It turns out that tetanus was treated successfully 100% of the time in patients that had high levels of vitamin C given to them. And that the tetanus shot itself, in comparison, was not anywhere near as effective. And furthermore, by the time you were exposed to the potential of the tetanus virus getting into your bloodstream and wreaking havoc, these tetanus shots were next to useless. Well, they were completely useless. And the whole thing was one big misnomer, one big pharma plot to create another so-called cure for a boogeyman, which, did exist. But at the time where tetanus was really going around, you had folks with insane vitamin C deficiencies, with scurvy and that kind of thing. And it turns out that there was a synergy there between all of those conditions. And right around the same time the so-called Savior vaccine was introduced, we were starting to get a handle on these things. They just happened to correlate in the same time frame. So as soon as I got done watching that, I said to my wife, "Honey, get me some vitamin C, please." And of course, she is way better prepared when it comes to that stuff than I am. And I'm your typical, full disclosure here, I'm your typical man. I have a reason to take it and I'll start taking it, but she's proactive with this kind of stuff. And of course, she had some really good vitamin C that your body could really absorb. And I just drank the living daylights out of vitamin C to bowel tolerance, because you can actually take it to bowel tolerance and it's not harmful to you. You don't want to take minimum amounts of vitamin C. Don't go on the internet and believe the bullshit recommendations for how much vitamin C you should take. Take it to bowel tolerance in that case. Furthermore, I didn't just take it to bowel tolerance. I also went to a friend of mine who's a holistic doctor here locally, Dr. Talmore, and I got IV vitamin C, which was my first time doing any IV vitamin C. And I've heard about IV vitamin C therapy being used for cancer patients. I've heard about it being used to help boost people's immune systems. And I knew that it would help to fight against the possibility of infection. So I figured I didn't want to fuck around. I didn't want to have my foot potentially be infected, potentially get tetanus, and so on and so forth. And I did not want to sit there and succumb to the pressures of the medical mafia. More on that in just a second. The next thing I did was I treated it with colloidal silver. Colloidal silver is awesome. It's not only great to ingest, but it's also good because they make a colloidal silver gel that you can buy in the stores. And mind you, you can produce colloidal silver yourself. I don't know how to make this gel, though. That would be interesting to learn how to make this cool gel product that I found, Ryan. But you put the gel topically on it, and I did that with some calendula oil, some colloidal silver, and I kept it really clean. And I also did a saltwater soak to help kind of draw out some of the toxins on it. And I just kept it clean, man, and I just stayed on top of it, and I really had to be disciplined about it. And you know, the long story short, it was nerve-wracking to the point where, you know, I have my folks on the line with me, and they're saying, Bob, you really need to go to the hospital. You're going to lose your foot. So now I got my mom on the phone. She's saying, Bob, you gotta go to the hospital. You can't mess around. You got a child. And it's, by the way, she sounded exactly like that, Ryan. that was her, actually. That was the recording we just played. So I'm saying, you know, I don't want to go to the hospital, but I am also worried that what I'm doing is going to be enough. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's scary looking.
Yeah. Well, the
scary looking wound.
20th century coming into 21st century rationale is that we can't solve problems on our own. We need to go see a professional.
A doctor, right. It's the appeal to authority, the appeal to their credential. The idea, the white coat syndrome, as I've heard it said many times. The idea that they're the experts. And you know what? They didn't know what the fuck they were talking about, because I did go to one of those doctors. I went to the emergency room. I wanted to placate my parents. I wanted them to feel like, you know, that I at least had a doctor look at it, so that I could pull that card out and say, don't worry, Mom and Dad, I went to your beloved hospital. I saw a doctor. You know, it's like, oh, thank goodness. It's like religion. Don't worry. Well, I won't go on that tangent. But you know what I mean? It's like, I saw the doctor. Now, okay, now everything's going to be fine because he saw a doctor, you know? Oh, good. So I went to the emergency room, and you're going to get a kick out of this. Okay? They came in, and, you know, they started asking me questions. Are you allergic to any medication? And I said, why, yes, I am. I'm allergic to thimerosal and, just thimerosal. I'm allergic to thimerosal. And he said, oh, okay. I have to ask the doctor about that. I haven't heard about thimerosal. And they're writing notes down, right? Yeah. All right, so the doctor comes in, and he looks at it, and he says, oh, what did you do? I said, well, I stepped on a pitchfork. He goes, ouch. See, yeah, no shit. And he looks at it, and he's saying, all right, well, you need to get a tetanus shot. And I said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And I started telling him about the research that I had done, and I referred him to resources on Dr. Suzanne Humphries, and I started mentioning to him all these, you know, different things, and he's, you know, kind of half-assed listening to me. And I start talking about, did you know that vitamin C? Have you heard about this study? And clearly he's starting to think, well, who the fuck is this guy? I'm the doctor. He needs to just shut up and do what I'm telling him, you know, to fix him. So he's getting that sort of complex going, and we have that dynamic. But I'm respectful about it, Ryan, and I'm not confrontational. I'm just like, nah, I don't think so. I don't thank you, but no, I don't think so. Here's why. What do you know about this? What do you think? And then I asked him if he knew what the ingredients were in the vaccination, and of course, he had no fucking clue. He actually told me to go look up the ingredients on the CDC website. Which they were there, of course. Mm. But then he said to me something very interesting. He said, well, if you're not going to get the vaccination, I'm going to have to check with my boss.
Who's his boss?
And why does it matter what his boss says? If I'm not going to take the vaccination, I'm not taking the vaccination. What does it matter if you check with your boss? You know what I mean? Like, it was a complete reckless oversight of my sovereignty, as if his authority figure, his boss, the head doctor at the hospital, or whomever he was referring to, would somehow factor into whether or not I was going to sit there and subject myself to a vaccine.
Well, through your education and your rational questioning, you basically compromised his position of authority. So he needed to appeal to a higher authority that hopefully you would respect more than you did him.
Well, unfortunately, he came back and he said, well, I said, all right, do what you got to do, dude, but I'm ready to get out of here, So, of course, they wanted to give me antibiotics. And I actually did fill the antibiotics, Ryan, and I put them in my freezer. I believe, this is common knowledge now, that antibiotics are overprescribed and no bueno. They ruin the flora and fauna in your gut, and they're just nasty, and you should avoid them if at all possible. But the prepper mindset in me thought, well, this is an opportunity to fill prescription for antibiotics. Maybe it's not a bad idea if shit hits the fan to have some random antibiotics lying around, just in case. Mm-hmm. So I did fill it. I did not take one, but I did fill it. And the doctor comes back and he says, well, you really should get the tetanus shot. Now, let's rewind a second. Do you remember what I told the nurse I was allergic to?
I do.
Thimerosal. And you heard that I asked the doctor what the ingredients were, right?
Yes, I do.
And you heard me say, nah, I don't want it, but he kept insisting that I take it. Well, in hindsight, I was thinking to myself, this guy was about to give me a shot. He would have gone through with it without even for a second realizing that I just told them that I was allergic to the number one ingredient, according to the CDC's website listed, thimerosal. It's amazing that the incompetency is, and again, this is a doctor, Ryan. This was my savior. This was what made my parents be able to sleep at night, because their baby boy was seen by a guy in a lab coat who knew nothing what he was talking about. And he may be well-intentioned. He might save people's lives when they come in and they need a defibrillator to shock them back to life. This doctor is probably a good person, I dare say. He's probably a nice person. He probably has done a lot of good, and I respect his possible passion in helping people with their health. And I hope that he takes his Hippocratic oath seriously. But he had no fucking clue. So, folks, end of the story here. Fast forward. I am now fully healed. It never got infected. And I'm so happy that it was a tale of success as opposed to a tale of, you know what, I should have just succumbed to the pressures of allopathic medicine and their ignorance and their fear paradigm. So, all is well. I'm dancing right now, Ryan, thinking about it.
Well, that's good to hear. How did you feel in the moment when it was tearing through your flesh? Because you never really addressed that.
No, and I'm not going to, but thanks for asking. How does it feel to have a pitchfork go through your flesh?
I haven't experienced it, and I'm hoping to learn through your...
Yeah, that'll be the next podcast, maybe.
So. Okay.
All right, we're going to have to wait on that.
The psychology
All right,
of pain.
so fast forward now to Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma. And we were following this storm for quite a while. I felt like the buildup for this storm was intensified with Hurricane, was it Harvey in Texas?
Yeah.
Harvey?
Yeah.
Charlie? I can't keep the damn name straight.
Harvey.
Harvey, okay.
Yeah.
So, we all saw the pictures of Harvey. Lots of flooding. We also saw the pictures of the guy who had that inflatable moat or barrier, I guess, around his house.
Is that crazy? What
Did
would
you
he
see
do
that guy?
for? Crazy.
You saw that,
prepper.
right?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's in this neighborhood where every single house is just annihilated. Everyone thought he was a freaking nutcase, and he's got this awesome barrier protecting him. And for Hurricane Irma, although we didn't experience flooding where I live, although some people were flooded, it wasn't as widespread as Houston. But I kind of felt like I was the guy in my area with that same awesome protective blow-up barrier between myself and the conditions. Because we did not take this lightly. Now, I want to address something, Ryan. We know that the media tends to hype things. We know that there is this desire to make things sexy, to do the fear porn, that kind of thing. We know that exists. Mm-hmm. And although I understand they try to manipulate things and they try to extort and, take a story and completely blow it out of proportion for ratings and that kind of thing. When a Category 5 hurricane is bearing down on you, you better pay attention. And this goes back to my analogy of the bear in the woods coming at you. And there's this new age bullshit philosophy that if we just think positively and we just have happy thoughts, that everything's going to be okay. Well, when that bear is coming at you in the woods and you're thinking happy thoughts and you're thinking positively, it's not the way to deal with it. That bear is going to come at you. It is going to maul you to death no matter how new-aged, enlightened you are, right? So the same thing could be said about these hurricanes. And I live in Florida. There's a lot of great reasons to live in Florida. One reason to not live in Florida is the potential of massive hurricanes that could annihilate an entire area. Mm-hmm. And it happened. Entire islands were wiped off the face of the map in the Caribbean. Very, very real. Okay, real is the word I'm looking for. Not scary, but real. And ignorance is not going to help. So we took it very seriously. I was looking at a lot of different potentialities, and that's one of the problems is, when the hurricane's far enough away, there's a lot of different models having it go here and having it go there. And I'm thinking about all the variables. Because that's what you should do. In a survival situation, in a growing freedom mindset, you got to think about all the potential variables. Do we bug out? If we bug out, when do we bug out? Why do we bug out? What could happen to our infrastructure? What could happen to the nuclear facilities? In Miami, Florida, there's a decrepit nuclear facility that is falling apart already, let alone the fact that a hurricane was bearing down on it. What happens if there's nuclear fallout from that? Then what? What do we do if the southern part of the state, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beaches, which is massively populated, what do we do if they're displaced and there's a massive dystopia of folks coming up and seeking refuge in our area, but as a result, looting and acting reckless? What do we do? What do we do? And this is where some of my preps that were already in place were able to speak to these things. And what do we do to, at the same time, avoid the hype and the traps? Because there was a real element like Black Friday. Ryan, you've seen the images of Black Friday, right?
Yes, I have.
You know, and I think that's an awesome caricature of how fucked up our society is. This Black Friday meme where people are trampling over each other like animals to the point where every year people die for this bullshit discount that they get on a flat screen TV. It's so insane. And sometimes I think about if there, you know, is an extraterrestrial race out there and they were to look down on us and see us on a Black Friday, you know, what would they say? You know, what are these things? Why are they trampling over each other for this piece of plastic? You know, what's wrong here? So when the scarcity mindset starts to kick in, people start going into that fight and flight mode, and that scarcity mindset starts to kick in, and people start acting crazy. They start going and clearing the shelves of any water. Gas shortages come in. And it's a perfect example of what I talked about during my talk at Free Your Mind 3 or 4, one of those, where I talked about scarcity-based mind control. Mm-hmm. And Pavlov did a test with chickens that really shows how this works. And I know human beings are not chickens, but the same principles remain true in this experiment he did, where he provided the chickens with an abundance of food and water. So whenever they were hungry, they would go and they would get some food and water, and it would always be there in complete abundance. Well, then he introduced conditions of scarcity. And only then did this pecking order start to develop, did this behavior of hoarding and stealing, and he could even get the chickens to kill one another with extreme scarcity-based manipulation. Well, the second you talk about a hurricane coming, people start to freak out. And they start to get as much water as they can. You hear about price gouging taking place, where people were charging $50 for a 12-pack of bottled water. Meanwhile, what am I doing, Ryan? I'm making sure that my hand pump and my well pump that provides me water no matter what, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why I love where I live, because we have this great resource of clean, fresh water just underneath us. I'm checking to make sure my pump works, my hand pump works, right? Because I already had the prep in place, and I know that long-term scenario, those bottles of water aren't even going to last those people that long.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to the store. I'm not falling for this. I did pick up gas because I do have a short-term generator, which was able to power my entire house. It was only an 8,000 kilowatt generator, but it was substantial enough where we were without power for 8 days. Many more people around us were without power for longer. We did not skip a beat because we had the generator in working order, mind you, because I prepared and made sure that it was working. Because when you actually do need to use it, you go to use it and it hasn't been looked at in a while, and sure enough, it doesn't work. So you got to be aware of these things. You got to be in practice. You got to make sure your preps are working and that kind of thing. So we didn't skip a beat. We did not skip a beat. My biggest fear, and we did have the eye wall go over us. By the time it got to us in North Central Florida, it was only a Category 1, maybe Category 2 at the very most. And I say only. That's still substantial. That still has trees falling down, flooding taking place, and so on and so forth. And thank goodness a tree didn't fall through my house. That was my biggest concern, because we do have several large trees around us. But we survived the storm. And this was because, A, we live in a safe house to begin with, with the certain design that is built to withstand these sorts of storms. And B, in the long run, we survived comfortably because we were prepared, and we had to. Because what ended up happening, which I wouldn't have necessarily thought would have happened, was unexpected and very, very limiting. So, what am I talking about? Ryan, you saw my Facebook video where I was going out chainsawing the massive trees blocking our road.
Yeah, I saw that.
So, and by the way, that's another thing I did do is I got the chainsaw sharpened and I made sure my chainsaw was in working order. Mm-hmm. And as I'm chainsawing these massive trees, I go get the tractor out and we're out chainsawing and we're clearing the road. Not just for myself, but for my neighbor as well. I'll get to that in just a second. But I put my chainsaw in the bucket of my tractor to go from one place to the next. And my chainsaw bumped out of the bucket of my tractor and I ran over my frickin' chainsaw. It was so annoying that I did this. I mean, it was just awful that I ran over my chainsaw. And I only had one chainsaw. And I got to thinking, what if I couldn't go to a store at some point and buy a new one?
Yeah.
Then what would I have done? I would have been without a chainsaw. And yeah, that's fine. I have regular saws, but you really do want these tools. They're not just, modern luxuries. They really are useful tools. There was no expedited way or no way without a lot of hard work and effort, which I'm not afraid of, mind you, but it really made it possible for us to get work done in a, bearable fashion to have that chainsaw.
Yeah.
So one of the things I thought is, I probably should have two chainsaws around. I know it's expensive, to buy a nice chainsaw. I like the steel saws, but I probably should have two around in case this ever happens again.
It's a really important point you bring up because I think quite often, even when a disaster situation strikes, you're still in the convenience mentality. And people do this quite often. They think, quite rightly so, under normal circumstances, as you said, you could just go out, you could get another. But you almost need to be proactive in the sense of foreseeing shit hitting the fan when shit hits the fan. Right. Things are going to go wrong. Murphy's Law is going to apply. So you have to come up with contingencies for your contingencies.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And ultimately, we need to kiss all of the things that we take for granted goodbye in a situation like this. Mm. Right? So, and there are little things that most of us in our day-to-day lives don't think about, like cell phone service. Cell phone service was gone. Completely gone. Mm-hmm. So anything that you rely on could very well be threatened in some of these situations. And for me, we're going to do a whole show on it, and I'm about to release the podcast after this one with Matthew Stein, the author of the book When Technology Fails. That'll be the next podcast we release, by the way, Ryan. And he talks about, these disasters. And I think it's the perfect timing to release that podcast. And he also talks about an EMP and how it, your car, even if you have gas, if it has some of the newer computer systems in it, it could very well not be usable.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that. And, with the chainsaw, for instance, well, what if you can't get gas for that chainsaw? So I do have a decent level of stuff stocked up. I have gas, I have some fuel stabilizers, that kind of thing. And I'm doing the best I can. But, that might last a month, that might last 2 months, but that's not a long-term thing. And I'm thinking about the big picture. I'm thinking about the immediate future. Mm-hmm. So we're out on the roads clearing the street, and it's bad, man. There's trees left and right, big old trees. And then we get to a point in our road where a tree hit a power line, and the power line was in the road with the wires dangling in the road and the pole blocking our road. Now, I've had it ingrained in my mind as a kid growing up in South Florida that you never ever touch a down electric wire. And I think that's a completely valid thing to be scared shitless about. You know, don't touch those power lines. Even if you think it might be dead, you don't know. It's not worth taking the risk of touching a power line, which will kill you, mind you, with this assumption or thought that it may be dead or it's probably dead. Even if you're 99.9% sure, you know, just don't risk it. And as a result of that line of thinking, we did not feel comfortable moving the line out of the way. So, we were stuck on our road. I feel like I'm setting up some dramatic thing. Stuck on our road post Hurricane Irma. So, being stuck on our road came with its own set of challenges. There was no way for us to get to civilization, if you will. You know, we live out in the country. It's not like I could walk to a gas station. It's several miles to the next gas station, which, by the way, was also out of power and would have done nothing for me, too. Mm-hmm. So, what did we do? Well, nothing. We didn't have to do anything. We had all the food we could ever eat. You know, we lived good. In fact, I think we were having a better time and eating better because I didn't have to go work the 9 to 5 with the storm and being trapped on the farm. Mm. You know, and I wasn't really that worried about it.
Yeah.
And that comfort, that feeling of security is priceless, man. Mm. Now, let's look at my neighbor. I think I've talked about it on the podcast. If not, I'm sure she's going to be making a regular appearance. I live out in the middle of the nowhere. I live on a 5-acre plot that's right next to another 5-acre plot. The two brothers own the plots, and they decided they were going to build their houses next to one another and live out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hundreds of acres of wildlife preserve. Well, both brothers sold their homes. One brother sold their house to me. The other brother sold their house to a nanny state-loving nutcase. And believe me, I have tried everything possible, and I'll tell you what I did do in just a second. I'm not trying to pick fights with this lady. But from the second we moved in where her dogs ate our chickens and she ignored it and denied it and refused to do anything nice about it or even acknowledge it, from the time she called the cops when I was practicing shooting my gun safely, to the time she called the cops again for shooting my gun safely, to the time right before the hurricane, 2 days before the hurricane. I don't know that you heard this story, Ryan. She called the cops because my 2 pygmy goats got out of the paddock and were eating weeds on the outside of her fence line. Can you believe that? I had these dangerous goats roaming freely that got out unexpectedly and were eating weeds on her fence line? I mean, they should have sent the SWAT team. They should have. I'm surprised there was only one cop who showed. Who, by the way, thought it was absolutely freaking hilarious that this crazy woman would call the cops over this. Mm-hmm. Even the cop shaking his head like, ma'am, what do you want me to do about this?
Was she threatened by the goats?
I don't know. Maybe she thought it was Baphomet. She thought Satanist coming after her or something. I don't know. So, and at that point, when she called the cops, I decided I was going to text her. And here's what I wrote her. And I'm going to read it verbatim. Okay? You ready for this? You really are a petty person. Because mind you, we have this history, her and I, by now. And I even gave her eggs after what happened, just to, I've done everything. And I try to ignore her for the most part, but,
You gave her eggs from the chickens that her dog killed.
Well, her dogs didn't kill all of the chickens,
Okay.
but I did. After that, I gave her eggs, and I tried to be, really nice to her.
Wow. You're a good man.
You got to treat your neighbors well, because at some point, I'm also preparing for her, because I want to talk about the scenario where she knocks on the door, and she says I'm hungry, and she wants me to take her in. I don't want to think about that, but at the same time, that scenario unfortunately weighs on me. What do I do? This neighbor that I despise, who kind of is a caricature of government. She, to me, represents government in her trying to control what I do on my property, right? Because when we had the several occasions of me shooting, not for very long, I tried to explain to her natural law, and I tried to explain to her how I wasn't causing her harm. And I said, hey, is there a time if the noise bothers you where I can do it, where it's not a nuisance to you maybe? And she just flat out said, no, I don't want shooting next to me. I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. And I said, ma'am, I don't care what you like. And at that moment, I realized that she is government. She is embodying, telling people what they can or cannot do when there is no victim, infringing on their sovereignty. So she became this representation of this philosophical dialogue that we've had on these broadcasts and that I've had in my research for many, many years now. She's a much more microscopic version of government, which can, you start with her maybe, and then you start with your local county, or and then next thing you know, you get United Nations, and it's just one thing after the other. But anyway, so back to my text message though, because I actually didn't finish reading what I sent her after the goat thing, and this is right before the hurricane, and I said to her, you really are a petty person, but I forgive you. And if you don't have any water after the storm, let me know, because I have a hand pump on my well that will give me access to water no matter what. That's what I wrote her. And do you know what her response was?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Actually,
No?
it wasn't that. She said, I'm sorry you feel that way, but you continue to break the law. And I'm thinking, what the fuck are you talking about? Break the law? My goats got out of the paddock. So, the hurricane happens. I'm out there clearing the road for her sake as well, busting my ass. And I think to myself, you know what, Bob? You really should check on your neighbor. Because that's the thing to do, Ryan. You have something like that, you should really come together. You should check on your neighbor. You should look out for them. So I texted her. I said, I hope everything's okay. And she, at that point, did text me back a decent response. And what she told me was very telling. She said that her back went out and her generator doesn't work, and she's having a hard time. And it was one of those moments where I was like, my first reaction was, aha, ha ha, told you so. Or not, I didn't tell her so, but ha ha, sucks for you. We got prepared. How do you like that, nanny state neighbor? Booyah. The real immature part of me. But the mature part of me, the humanitarian in me, made me want to see if I could help her. And, she didn't take me up on it, of course, but I offered. So she had a hard time. And we didn't. And it was the most beautiful contrast and illustration of what we talk about on this show. In real life. In action. And at the end of the day, the bottom line, folks, is the hurricane was a test run. It was the most simplistic test run. It was easy compared to what I think may come down the pike. And I'm not trying to get into hyperbolic fear mode. I'm not trying to, you're going to go to a FEMA camp. By the way, we'll talk about FEMA camps in the second hour here, and we'll talk about FEMA in the second hour. And I want to tell you what a high-up FEMA official told me that was attending the Free Your Mind conference a couple years ago. That will always stay with me, and I got to tell you what he told me. And we'll talk about weather and weather manipulation and how, they very well could be steering these storms, because we know they could steer them away from us. So the question is, if they can steer them away from us, then why don't they do that? And if they don't do that, then at what point does that equate to negligence, criminal negligence, right? Because if that technology exists, why don't they use it? Why don't they? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a whole slew of great topics in the second hour, including, there's just so much to talk about. We'll talk about the executive orders. We'll talk about tips and resources for self-sufficiency and preparedness so that you can act and get ready in a similar fashion, if not in a greater fashion than what I did. Lots to talk about still. We're just getting warmed up here, and we're setting the stage, Ryan, for the second hour of today's broadcast. But I guess I want to wrap up the experience in the first hour with, to me, it's a test run that I really do think that potentially, if our grid goes down, namely, or if there is a more massive, widespread collapse, that we're going to have a much tougher time. There's going to be more unrest. And, mind you, I was ready for the unrest too, with some of the aforementioned firearms that my neighbor hates. Mind you, if there was people looting our properties, I probably would protect my neighbor with those same guns that she hates. Meanwhile, she would probably be the first one to turn me in for having guns if they were to go around like in Katrina, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and do door-by-door gun confiscations. But the bottom line is, folks, preparedness is of the utmost importance. It really came into handy. This was a test run for me. I really learned from these experiences. They, give me more insight, like that chainsaw thing, for instance. Wouldn't have thought to have 2 chainsaws on hand. It lets me think about things that you never know would come up. It's a lot like gardening in that sense, where you don't just throw seeds in the ground and think that you're going to grow this abundance, this beautiful garden and be able to live happily ever after in a utopia. No, the gardening process is one that requires trials and tribulations to learn from. It's one of those things where you have to experience a certain bug maybe to know what to expect or how to treat it. And that is what we did in both of the aforementioned tales in this first hour of Growing Freedom. Ryan, when we come back in just a second for subscribers, we're going to talk about those FEMA camps, what they're really for, why they're set up. I am so excited. We are just getting started here, Ryan. Lots of good stuff to still get into for subscribers. Please support us and subscribe to Growing Freedom. Tell your friends. Check out our daily content and so much more. We'll be back with hour number 2 in just seconds.